author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Tensions between the two remaining superpowers, the United States and China, continue to grow. Whether it's an economic Cold War, global positioning in favor of America's political adversaries, and even the modern-day globalist version of soft power influence, China is indeed America's chief competitor. And yet, from the White House, nary a discouraging word is heard. Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special edition, we discuss all things Middle Kingdom with our panel of experts, Dave Patterson and Andrew Moran. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's dive right in, introduce our panel, and talk all things China. And here we are. We're going to be talking all things China today, how this impacts America economically, how this impacts America militarily. And to join us in the conversation and to aid with hopefully a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of experience, we're joined by Andrew Moran, Liberty Nation's Economics Affairs editor, who knows everything fiscal there is to know in the world, and Mr. Dave Patterson, retired Air Force pilot and former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller. And that is not the first time I've said that today. This is the only time I have gotten that particular title right. Welcome aboard, Dave and Andrew. Mr. Dave Patterson.
Thank you, Mark. Glad to be with you.
Okay, guys. So I figure what we're going to do today is we're going to discuss all the various factors that are impacting American policy at the moment, how the things that China are doing are actually impacting people in the United States and indeed in the wider world. And I guess the first thing I want to start with is what China's doing to America with the assistance of America. And there are two things that spring to my mind there. And that's firstly, there's the SPR sell-off, that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve sell-off that was first discussed with China so they could, as far as I can see, so they could get advance warning and buy up the Strategic Petroleum Reserves. Let's start with you, Andrew. What went down there?
Well, reports came out a couple of weeks ago that said Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm, she communicated with the Chinese government about its plans to dump all this oil from the emergency stockpiles, or as you call it, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. But later, when this report came out, Granholm said, "Oh, well, we were just discussing this with all the countries because this was supposed to be a globally coordinated event." But the problem with this, well, there are many problems with this issue. The main idea, as I discussed on previous LN media, was that the idea was that China would be focusing more on buying more from the U.S. as opposed to buying more from Russia. The issue is that China bought both Russia and the United States, so that plan backfired immediately. The second thing too is that right now, as a result of buying from both Russia and the U.S., China now has the world's largest stockpile of crude oil. Despite having an anemic post-pandemic economy where GDP is coming in less than expected, you have deflation now. They're canceling unemployment data to report to the public. They have 1 billion barrels of crude oil sitting in its reserves, which is astronomical because now they can weather any storm, any geopolitical strife, whatever the case. So I find the SPR, China, and the U.S. Quite a fascinating turn of developments.
Dave, let's talk about what these words actually mean. Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I think the important word there, Dave, is strategic, isn't it? And if Joe Biden is selling off America's strategic reserves, doesn't that mean that they're limiting future potential strategies?
Well, it's an ugly situation on two levels. First of all, that he would basically reduce the strategic petroleum reserve, as you say, which is supposed to be used in emergencies to backstop problems in the United States. And
sorry to interrupt, Dave. There is an emergency. Joe Biden's polling numbers are just going down. That is the national emergency, I believe. Please carry on.
That was going to be my second point.
Oh, sorry.
But the fact is that the petroleum reserve is an emergency a capability that you use obviously only when you have in a crisis or contingency. The Biden administration has chosen to use that far more for political reasons to backstop their failing policies in terms of the economy, as well as to try to lower the fuel costs at the pump. And in every single case, they have failed miserably because it's a perverse approach to managing a country like the United States.
I think it's worth pointing out, too, just for the audience, to put this in context, since President Biden was inaugurated, the strategic petroleum reserves have declined 43%. So nearly half of the reserves are gone. When he took office, it was more than 600 million barrels. Today, it's more than 300 million. This is quite incredible. It's also worth pointing out, too, is that when the initial crash in oil prices happened in the early days of the pandemic, President Trump, he wanted to start scooping up barrels and barrels of oil at $20 a barrel. So he would have added enormously to the stockpiles, but Democrats said, no, you're bailing out big oil. So I think that's also worth pointing in the context in the issue of SPRs.
Yeah. Well, I think it goes, Andrew, to the basic, crackerjack philosophy and economic position that the Biden administration has, which has always been to buy high, sell low. And it is just indicative of how naive and foolish they have been.
Well, it's really funny that people aren't realizing that this reserve, as you say, it's for emergencies, national emergencies, above and beyond Joe Biden's poll numbers. But the fact is, there's a war taking place in Europe, and it's with Russia, and Russia is not that far away from America. And if anything were to, God forbid, if anything were to escalate, then you've got a position where Russia and China hold all of the world's oil reserves. They could essentially shut us down, shut America down, shut Europe down, couldn't they? If they...
Well, don't you have those windmills? The windmills can keep everyone warm and cook their foods and all that stuff. So we're perfectly okay with windmills and solar panels, guys.
Dave, what's your military background take on this?
I think that the fact that the Biden administration actually sold, to Andrew's point, 200 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is important, and that China bought it in order to fill their coffers. It is really the important point here. I don't believe that. I'm not a gloom and doomer. I mean, the United States would rally. We would use the what's left of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve as a backstop. We can still buy from OPEC, and so I think that we wouldn't go belly up. On the other hand, we have to realize, too, that while we're chatting about, the ease with which we would buy from OPEC, China has becoming more and more intrusive into the daily lives of the OPEC nations, particularly in the Middle East, with recent military exercises with the UAE. I mean, who would have ever believed that?
Well, actually, I think it's worth diving a bit more into the issue of OPEC and also U.S. production. So first, U.S. production has, aside from the first 2 weeks of August, has been flat for all of 2023, and compared to previous years, is actually below trend growth. So I don't know if the country could rally around that, because production is on the decline. If you look at the Baker Hughes oil rig count, that's been on the decline since last October, since hitting a post-pandemic peak. So that's worth pointing out. When it comes to OPEC, OPEC's new strategy is now to look forward to Asia. It's no longer concerned about the United States. Now, this, whether it's economic and politically, I'll leave that to Mr. Patterson. But we look at all the data, all the announcements. It's clear that Saudi Arabia and all the OPEC and OPEC plus nations, they're rallying around China. Just the other day, the BRICS, which I don't know if you guys want to go into that too much, but the BRICS summit, they announced that they're all issuing all these bonds in other local currencies other than United States dollars. So politically, the OPEC doesn't so much care about the United States anymore. Plus, OPEC production has been on the decline to support prices at the price for, I think, at least $70 a barrel. So that's also worth pointing out too, just based in the fact that the United States, they want to replenish the stockpiles or the SPR when prices are below $70. So it's such a convoluted issue that I don't know if the U.S. could withstand an emergency.
Well, we'll be delving into what China's doing in other parts of the world, specifically the relationships they're forming, after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio with our special guests, Dave Patson and Andrew Moran. Now, earlier in the show, we were talking about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and how China took a great deal of advantage of purchasing the stuff that Joe Biden sold off. But now I want to talk a little bit about China's foreign adventurism that's taking place. Obviously, we're seeing this, gentlemen, we're seeing this in Africa quite a lot, where they're really getting a foothold. And recently, in South Africa, Chairman Xi Jinping, he congratulated the African nations on, I think that the exact words were, shaking off the yoke of colonialism. Now, am I right or wrong here? Is China really just opting for a new 21st century form of monetary and military colonialism in Africa? Let's start with you, Andrew, on that one.
Well, if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the Chinese way of just expanding its tentacles all over the world, Africa is one place, throughout the Middle East, South America. So China is really taking advantage of all these poor countries by saddling them with all this enormous debt and loans, and they're building up their infrastructure, creating jobs. I think to summarize the issue, there was a recent African president. I forgot which country it was, the president, but he said that China and Russia, they're the ones providing us with infrastructure. They're the ones providing us with jobs, but it's the United States that's dictating our internal policies. So I think that's the sentiment that a lot of countries are now having when it comes to Chinese companies or Chinese government flooding the country with all this yuan and all this development that's occurring throughout these regions.
Dave, what's your take on that? What kind of foothold? How does the foothold that China is getting, let's say in Africa, for example, how is that affecting what America's doing and America's, let's call it, diplomatic weight within the world, which used to be, to my mind, something of great strategic importance, but perhaps not quite so much anymore?
Well, I think that as you point out, I don't think that the United States is being as impressive in Africa as it has been in the past. I think too that the near term shiny object of China and Russia. China actually now more than Russia, because Russia is otherwise engaged, but through their surrogate, the Wagner Group, I think that they're imposing a presence. Sudan, Niger, pick your favorite. They have a presence. China more so in terms of developing its intrusion into the social and cultural structure of African nations. They're now very intrusive into the K through 12 education system, and they basically are doing into Africa what they attempt to do here in the United States through the Confucius Institute and so forth, and that is to impose themselves into the culture and extol the virtues of their brand of communism/socialism.
But what's concerning is a lot of these governments, they're unable to service their debts to China. And just recently, Laos, they have a huge loan from China as part of the whole Belt and Road Initiative. And they were unable to repay the loan. So what China did is that the Chinese government associated firms, they took over the utilities company in Laos. So China is now responsible for the energy infrastructure in Laos. So when you see a lot of these African countries who are unable to service their debts, repay their loans, even just bow down now perhaps to Chinese interests, China could just say, well, you owe us all this money. If you don't repay, we'll just take over this key piece of infrastructure, that key infrastructure. So that's also worth this expansion of Chinese governments into every part is quite concerning for the domestic issues.
I mean, sorry, Dave, carry on, Dave.
It's even true in South America, Andrew. I mean,
yes.
You look at Brazil and their new president and how he is cozied up to the Chinese government and Chinese companies coming in. Ecuador is very much leaning toward developing a relationship with China. So yeah, we're on our back door. We have all of these initiatives that China is basically perpetrating. It's really disturbing because you're going to wake up one morning and you're not going to have a sushi place to go, but you will have spring rolls.
It's kind of strange to me because it seems that where before America was quite a leader in pushing for democracy, which there's another argument to be had there about how much involvement America should have in the setting up of governments in foreign nations. That's another argument to have. But it seemed before that it was all about human rights and making sure that people were watered and fed during emergencies. But then the shift went to teaching gender studies in schools and promoting various social mores that are not even considered a majority opinion within the United States. So perhaps it's a case of it wasn't so much as China overtook America in these diplomatic negotiations, but rather that America ceded its position by focusing on trying to bring an entire continent towards a progressive ideology rather than dealing with the nuts and bolts of let's get safety, let's get training, let's get food and water, let's get infrastructure in place. And China just stepped into that gap, didn't they?
Well, it's more of a case of having your cake and eating it too, because yes, on one hand, China is providing that type of investment to build those things. At the same time, the United States is fostering this ridiculous LGBT and the neo-Western values of gender studies, but they're subsidizing it. So Pakistan, let's use that as an example, which is also part of the Belt and Road Initiative in China. Pakistan, they got $10 billion to have gender studies, so they want this money. So they'll kowtow and say, "Yo, yes, we're going to learn about LGBT studies and gender transitioning, give us $10 billion, but at the same time have their hand out and say, give us Chinese dollar, give us Chinese yuan."
Dave, what's your take?
Oh, I think that the United States is in the unenviable position of having products to sell that nobody wants to buy. And that is, in a nutshell, what the United States under the Biden administration and the Obama administration before that, they have an agenda, a social justice agenda that they think that they can push on the United States, and by the way, we'll push it on the rest of the world. And it goes to this notion of the United States ridiculous concept of being now a leader in a globalist context. We aren't a leader in the globalist context if we continue to do what we're doing. It's just and it's a national security issue because the people within the United States are pretty much powerless when it comes to what the government's pushing, the U.S. government's pushing on the rest of the world, and they're not buying.
I think that appears to be the problem with much modern politics. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Dave Patterson and Andrew Moran after this short break. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back here on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. And we're continuing our conversation on China and how China's actions are affecting the US and vice versa. We are joined once again by Dave Patterson and Andrew Moran. Gents, thanks for sticking around. I guess the next part I really want to talk about is what's happening domestically for China and how that is impacting things across the water in the United States and to a less degree in Europe. Reminds me of the saying that if the US sneezes, everybody else catches the cold, but that seems to have been reversed. Now, Dave, do you want to give us a quick rundown of what you see happening in China at the moment?
Well, what I see happening in China is that despite whatever economic woes they might have, they are still very much attempting to, particularly in the United States, to be as intrusive as they possibly can. Grand Forks is any indication where China attempted to buy land in contiguous with the base that has strategic assets, is headquarters for units that have ICBMs, and now is used as the what's called the Test Resource Management Center, where they test unmanned vehicles for sensors. And this is troubling that that China would be your next door neighbor.
Yeah, there really is this push by let's say a certain percentage of lawmakers to try and ban sales of land, specifically strategic land, but also other land, to the Chinese. Now, here, when they say the Chinese, I'm presuming they mean the Chinese government, but it's very difficult to kind of unstrip those things, because companies operate in China under the auspices of the Chinese Communist Party. I remember I lived in China for many years, and while I was there, I remember this story going around, and I have no reason to believe it's not true, based on the people I heard it from. But there was a minister, a local minister, talking to the reporters and the editors in the newsrooms, and he said, if you think that you're a free and independent press and you don't work for the government, think again. And this is really the situation with many companies, especially Chinese companies that want to operate overseas. They are entwined, they're hand in glove with the government. So it's difficult to kind of separate a Chinese company wanting just to buy land for further development, or is that the Chinese government looking to gain a strategic military advantage within the United States? Andrew, what do you make of it?
Well, if you want to use an example, WH Group, it purchased, I think it was Smithfield Foods a few years ago, and Smithfield was one of the largest pork producers in the United States today. That deal was financed by the Chinese government. So you and I had the discussion years ago about how, all these companies, they get drunk on Beiju because they know they're going to be financed by the Chinese government and the People's Bank of China. Yeah,
it's Baijiu, and it's a drink. It's a drink to rot your insides. It really is. I mean, some of the stuff's very nice. Some of it's you don't want to go too near it. But yeah, this is like the state-owned enterprises. So China produces all this money and then puts it into the four state-run banks, the four big state-run banks, on the understanding that this quantitative easing, it will trickle down to the people, but the state-owned enterprises, of which they are numerous, get the lion's share of that. Now, those companies, they're using Chinese government money that's just being printed out of nowhere to buy a foothold within the United States. And I can't see that as being sensible on any level.
Well, I'll look at some of the numbers. Let me just say some of the numbers, and then Dave can dive into analysis. So, of all the U.S. Private farmland in the United States, 3.1% is foreign owned. China owns about 0.03% of that farmland, the same as Belgium. But who owns the most U.S. farmland? Canada. Canada owns about 33% of U.S. land. So better be prepared, guys. We're going to invade your food supply chain.
But of course, China owns 66% of Canada. Dave, what's your take?
Well, I think that what we're seeing, and it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's encouraging, and that is that all of this land grab is going to come back to be a liability for China. What we've seen recently is, Evergrande, which is one of the largest real estate companies in China, has declared bankruptcy, as we may have talked about, and but they failed to meet their debt obligation a year and a half ago, which was a serious signal. And Country Garden, which is another large real estate company that has equities here in the United States and employs 300,000 people, failed to meet their payment obligation twice now, and so they look like they're in trouble. And it all goes back to, I think, and Andrew can speak to this probably more within greater detail, but the Xi government has placed greater restrictions and regulations on how much debt companies can actually acquire. And so if your business, depends on being able to acquire debt, and you can't, Now you're having a cash problem that will lead to difficulties, and we're seeing that happen now. And
what's going on in China? It's not just relegated to Evergrande and Country Garden. If you look at some of the numbers, I think 40% of the businesses that have sold homes to home buyers, their property developers have gone bankrupt. So this is a wide scale going on in China. And there was a certain publication, I think it was before the pandemic, warned that there was a ticking time bomb going on in China, and that was called Liberty Nation. Liberty Nation had a great article talking about the paper tiger and how that economy was on the decline, and that mainly had to do with all this debt that had been traveling throughout the world's second largest economy. The amount of debt, people don't realize how much debt that China has, and a lot of this debt is off the books too, because as Mark discussed earlier, a lot of it's funneled through private companies, and then you create a wider issue of these zombie companies that don't produce anything, and they can't even service their debt, but they keep getting either bailed out by either the banks, the government, or the PBOC, or they get absorbed by a larger corporation. So this is a symptom of a broader disease occurring in China, where you're not being productive, and now you have a new issue going on in China when it comes to the labor market. A lot of the new generation of workers, they don't want to go into the key sectors that China focuses on a lot, like manufacturing, mining. They want those cushy white collar jobs. It's like going in a time capsule of the United States. And back in the early 20th century, everyone worked at factories, had their steel pails, and then as time went on, the newer generations wanted to work at the desk, wanted to have the white collar jobs. And today, the exact same thing happened in China. People working in factories, people working in the mines. Now, the new generation, they want to start getting white collar jobs, but guess what? There aren't any white collar jobs. So that's why the youth unemployment rate is at an all-time high in China, and why Xi Jinping is either banning the economists from talking about this, or why they're restricting the data in the first place.
And consider that while they're accumulating all this debt, while they're spreading their tentacles around the world and investing, they're also paying us much more for defense and national security than they ever have before. And so they have obligations in terms of the outflow of money to buy ships, airplanes, invest in their army and buying artillery, and also creating the wherewithal whereby they would hope to invade Taiwan if they don't peaceably submit, and that's not likely. So they have obligations on top of the debt that they have accumulated, and obligations that don't appear to go away, I might add.
But you can tell that the Chinese government is so concerned about all their debt that they've accumulated, especially since the pandemic, that they're not unleashing the mother of all bombs and stimulus to the country. So the country, Xi Jinping is just terrified of all this debt. So that's why they're not unleashing more stimulus as they had in previous financial crises and downturns. It
seems that operating in foreign lands covers a lot of sins domestically when you have trouble at home. Andrew and Dave will be right back after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back here on Liberty Nation Radio, speaking with our guests Dave Patton and Andrew Moran, talking all things China. I really want to get into how globalism and the global markets are reacting to China, and what the globalism really means for sovereign nations. And specifically, Dave, I think you've got an interesting point to make about how developing nations are set to get a little bit more money and how that works out. Could you give us the basics on that?
Well, basically, what we're facing is this perverse situation where China, the number 2 economy in the world, is considered a developing nation. Well, this is absurd. But as a developing nation, it gets preference in the International Monetary Fund, which, incidentally, many Democrats have said we should increase the level of what's known as the draw. And guess who's going to take advantage of that? China, the developing nation.
It's ridiculous, really, isn't it, to say it's a developing nation? I mean, I kind of understand the opening up of China that happened so many decades ago. And I can see why it might have been a sound policy at the time, because there's a lot of strategic issues behind it, strategic thinking behind it. But to continue with this, for example, the most favored nation states, or considering it a developing nation, when I mean, many people are worried that China is going to overtake the United States economically soon enough. Andrew, what do you make?
That's right. No, that's going to be India. India is going to be the one who takes over China. I mean, if you look at Modi, Modi is really bullish on his country. He's bullish on the rupee. The rest of the world is now bullish on the rupee. So India is going to be the superpower. So now, okay, so this is such a confounding issue for many reasons. Okay, so this past spring there were several hearings in Congress about how the U.S. needs to fill the vacuum that China's overtaking U.S. role in, let's say, the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. So that's where this whole idea comes from, whereby the U.S. needs to start financing more, putting more money into IMF and World Bank. Janet Yellen wants a few $1 billion, and Republicans say, why are we doing that? We're already providing all this money, and we don't have any money itself. So Dave is correct. So China is considered a developing country, so it's going to get money from the IMF and the World Bank. At the same time, it's also one of the leaders of lending out to countries all over the world, as I keep repeating, the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's going to take that money it gets, transfer it to other countries all over the world, and the U.S. is going to subsidize this because it's putting more money to the IMF and World Bank. So this policy doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I get everyone's concern that China is cozying up to everybody by just giving them billions of dollars or billions of yuan, but overall, the public policy pursuit, everyone's confused. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. As George Bush would say, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing.
George Bush would probably say the left hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. Now, so we've had some top people in the U.S. government, Janet Yellen and Antony Blinken, talking about not seeking economic advantages. Dave, could you expound on that for me, please?
I know this is something that causes my head to explode. Here we have our top diplomats, our top economic advisors to the Biden administration. They go to China and they say, look, we're not trying to get any economic or any advantage over China in world trade. Of course we are. Of course we are. We're in competition. Why would we not? This is just madness. And it shows the basic philosophy of the Biden administration, which is not to be a winner. And I would offer you this, that recently, President Biden said that the economic woes of China represent a ticking time bomb. I'm not sure what he thinks the ticking time bomb is, but nonetheless, he said that. And what he explained in the following sentence was, remember that bad people, when they're bad people, do bad things. Unless, of course, they don't have the chance to do bad things because they're up against a greater power. And that's where the United States needs to be. It needs to be the deterrent, greater power, so that bad people don't do bad things.
Well, I think when it comes to the United States and China, I mean, the U.S. is beholden mainly to China based on the fact that, not for one thing, U.S. still imports nearly record amounts of goods and services from China. I think the last number was $400 billion. So the U.S. still needs to import lots from the country. Otherwise, it adds more to its inflationary problems. Although you could argue that there's going to be a deflation currency, which could benefit everybody, but that's an entirely different discussion, of course. And two, China still owns about $850 billion of U.S. treasuries. So as I've alluded to before, I think a lot of this bowing down to China and conceding defeat has more to do with, please don't sell you more U.S. debt. Please don't reduce your shipments of goods and services to the United States. I think more of it's just out of a desperate plea, and perhaps maybe Dave can touch upon this. Maybe it's also desperation and bowing down after eating mushrooms at China by not invading Taiwan. Because if there's an invasion of Taiwan, say goodbye to your semiconductors, say hello to inflation or rampant acceleration inflation. So there are many obstacles that the U.S. has to go through to ensure China is happy and it doesn't exacerbate its position on the world stage.
I think that, Andrew, if that's the case, and I don't deny that it is, then I think that what the combatant commanders in the Pacific are doing is the right thing. Every opportunity they have to send warships through the Straits of Taiwan, the South China Sea, that they do that. They demonstrate the fact that the United States won't be denied the freedom of navigation through those waters, regardless of what China says. And so that's the level of demonstration of power that causes China to pause, at least for the time being.
Hey guys, let's briefly talk about the relationship between Russia and China and how that's impacting everything. Dave, why don't you lead us off on that?
Yeah, recently the Chinese sent an emissary to Russia and to Belarus, incidentally. And of course, we can understand why China wanted to reconnect with Russia to assure them that their support will be still forthcoming, that they're not going to diminish support in Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. To their trip to Belarus, a little bit different, I think. Belarus has been threatening the northern border with Ukraine. Belarus has just recently became the location for Russian tactical nuclear weapons. And my sense is that that China's message to Belarus is just remember that even though you're the lackey ally of Putin, you have a responsibility, and don't get too excited about invading Ukraine because you'll be there alone.
I think that lackey ally, I think that's a great term to describe the relationship between Russia and China right now. Because at this stage, Putin needs China a lot more than China needs Russia at this point in the invasion, or just in terms in general relationships. If you look at some of the numbers, let's say the Chinese yuan is now the number one currency used in Russia. Russians are depositing huge amounts of Chinese yuan into bank accounts. Chinese companies are working heavily with Russian companies and Russian banks. So I think once the whole energy crisis subsides, there's no longer, $80 barrels of oil. China doesn't need Russia anymore. So I think that's why it's worth discussing the BRICS coalition, or the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa partnership, because China is the one who's advancing more countries joining the BRICS. So if China has greater official relations with more countries, that doesn't need to depend so much on Russia moving forward. I think actually what happens is that China wants the same thing to happen to Russia as all these other countries, which is mainly the internationalization of the Chinese yuan. Because if the yuan is the number one currency in Russia, then why can't the yuan be the number one currency in, let's say, I don't know, Brazil or Pakistan or all these other nations belonging to the, you guessed it, Belt and Road Initiative. So I think that the political relations is a fascinating one to dive into and analyze.
Yeah, I think that's right, and don't forget also that between Russia and China, Russia has a market for its uranium, its enriched uranium, which it sells to China, and it causes the relationship to be tighter with regard to the nuclear partnership that they have. And if I recall, BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China. Is that what we're talking about?
And South Africa. And
South Africa.
And all these other countries are now trying to join the BRICS, like Saudi Arabia. If Saudi Arabia joins BRICS, oh my goodness, that's just because right now the BRICS account for 40% of GDP per purchasing power parity. So once you add Saudi Arabia to the mix, you say goodbye to the West, because those countries are going to dominate the global economy and the international discussion.
And this way leads globalism. Gentlemen, thank you ever so much for joining me today. I appreciate your time and your input.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
And that's about all we have time for on this special edition of Liberty Nation Radio. My thanks to our guests, Andrew Moran and Dave Patterson, and to you at home for taking the time to tune in. I'll leave you with the words of Napoleon Bonaparte, who said, "There sleeps China. God pity us if she wakes. Let her sleep." Well, it seems the alarm bell is ringing for that particular sleeping dragon. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are LibertyNation.com.